Howdy, John.
Howdy, Ryan.
Howdy, Asiago. All right, so we're moving on to point number 11 of the leverage points enumerated by Donella Meadows. And so this one, following up from the constants, parameters, and numbers of a system, the next 11th leverage point, the next one up that she denotes is the sizes of buffers and other stabilizing stocks relative to their flows. And again, going with that like bathtub analogy, kind of, she talks about, well, if you compare a lake with a river, rivers will much more often overflow than lakes, because if you
The
increase the
size.
flow into a river, it only has a small buffer that then will spill over with additional inflows coming through. Whereas a lake is relatively large, so you need a much larger inflow to actually change the level of a
The water
lake
level. Yeah.
versus yeah, exactly, versus a river.
And two, that kind of just even on the environmental level, it made sense because rivers flood all the damn time.
Yep,
But
exactly.
oftentimes we don't really think terribly often at all about a lake. Uh, Honestly, the only time you really think about like lakes flooding, I would say, is like when like the government like unleashes like a dam or something that ends up flooding like some low level community like all at once. It creates like a lake over where perhaps a town used to exist or something like that. But that
Right, right.
obviously required a truly astronomical amount of water.
Well,
Um,
again, the inflow there is comparable to the size of the lake itself, right? Similar
right.
to how, like, when you get torrential rains, the inflow of additional water to a river or a stream can be comparable to the amount of standing water that is in there generally, right?
Yeah.
So when you start to change the inflows of the outflows to be as large as those stocks or buffers, that's when you get massive disruptions to the conditions of
Yeah.
the system itself.
Which is why obviously the smaller the system, the easier it is for it to be overwhelmed, rather than a large system that's just more robust due to its the fact that it's big. It can eat the incoming forces a lot easier. That that definitely helped me. The lakes versus the rivers thing definitely made quite a lot of sense there. And I'm thinking also in terms of systems management and historically, like part of how humans have tried to manage the flooding of rivers has been with things like dams and making like lakes that can take like the artificial like overflow of water and then like also like canals and things like
Mm-hmm.
that where we can divert like excess water through right when there is a lot of water that then prevents the river from flooding in a normal fashion. um,
Yeah.
and so I think that was part of that's what a buffer can often be, even something like a canal or whatever. Like for instance, the Danube River in Vienna very rarely ever floods over into the city at all because they have built such a complex system of like these canals where anytime like the water starts rising, they can just basically open up one of the canals and fill it up with excess water, and that hasn't pushed any water over any banks yet.
Right,
Um,
right.
so like even her like very specific example actually I think applies to exactly how humans have oftentimes tried to manage large complex
Manage, yeah.
systems
Mm-hmm.
through including these like buffers of like lakes and dams and canals and things like that that can just divert excess water from from the river itself so that it doesn't actually have the same horrendous impact that it obviously once could. Um, Even thinking about like the Tigris and the Euphrates, one of the ways that an ancient Sumer and Akkad they diverted a lot of those floodwaters into all of those irrigation ditches, right? That they dug over these huge, vast, what would have been kind of like deserty areas, and they just covered them in all these little irrigation ditches. And then when all that water flowed in, it could just spread out across this like wide, terrain of land, and it didn't, just run over the towns and whatever that were nearby as a result. And it obviously had the added benefit of also fertilizing now the farmland. So
Yeah, yeah.
really, really fascinating to think about in those kind of terms.
Yeah, yeah. And so those are examples of stocks, right? So when you have materials that are standing within the system, that are the things that will be inflowed or outflowed from the system. The other, thing she discusses here are buffers, right? Which is a term from chemistry. And so that's if you have a solution, and you want it to be resistant to changes in pH, you can have a buffer, meaning an excess of anions or cations, positively or negatively charged ions, that then if you add an acid or add a base to it, it won't change its pH because those additional particles will be there to catch the acid or the base. And so, so you can think about a stock or a buffer being either ways to catch inflows or outflows that aren't supposed to be there, or materials already there so that as you add or subtract from that, you have a large stock so that it won't change drastically compared to those inflows or the outflows. So another example she uses, right, is like a business's inventory. So like if Home Depot only carried like one screwdriver, and then anytime you wanted to buy a screwdriver, somebody came and bought it, and they had to like buy a new one, then they'd at max only sell one screwdriver a day, right? So they carry on hand probably more screwdrivers than they're going to sell in a day, and maybe that's 100 screwdrivers, and maybe not all those get sold, and it would be cheaper to keep fewer of them, but then they'd have a more limited capacity to be able to sell
Yeah.
all of them when there is a demand for them. So
Yeah.
those stocks and those buffers are important to make sure the system kind of continues to run, even if the inflows or the outflows kind of change in magnitude, within some range.
Yeah. She gets some. She apparently was like an environmental scientist as well, and so a lot of her examples are environmental.
Yep.
Another one that was quite interesting that she talked about was just the fact that I didn't actually know this, but the soils um, in the eastern United States are more affected by acid rain because they don't have the large deposits of calcium that exist in the soils in the west
They don't have a buffer. Yeah.
that can like neutralize that acid when it comes
Yep.
in. But as she points out, just because the western soils can deal with acid rain better, that's not a solution to acid rain. That is so again, which is why I think that it's lower on the list. Like obviously, if we were talking in, you know, where to place a solution to a problem, you would typically think of one again that would get more of a root cause. You would want to think more about how do we halt the acid rain from being acid rain to begin with, as opposed to like going around trying to make the soil somehow better able to deal with acid rain.
Right, just because the soil is more resistant to the acid rain doesn't mean that there isn't a threshold over which it will still have an effect.
Right.
And also doesn't mean there aren't other knock-on effects from the acid rain, right?
Exactly.
So you solved one like small area, some localized impact of the acid rain, but acid rain is still going to cause issues elsewhere.
Exactly. And I guess too, this is a good place to think about like there can be solutions that work well in certain areas at certain times, and maybe some of them should still be pursued. But there are often more effective ways of dealing with problems, at least on the whole, than some of these more like small interventions. And if you get too zoned in on the small ways to intervene in a system, you might miss some of the ways that we need to like fundamentally address some root cause of the system here, as opposed to just treating this one particular like potentially, I guess, I don't know, this might not even be possible, but just for the sake of like an analogy, somebody could come up with the idea that maybe we need to supplement the soils in the eastern US with more calcium to resemble the soils in the western United States more. And that would be like a way to address the problem, but clearly not the most effective one, as opposed to just getting rid of the acid rain.
Right. And what else? Yeah, so she talks about the size of stocks and buffers, right? And her commentary on how this is effective, has or how effective stocks and buffers are as a leverage point. Has a couple of components to it. One is that these are usually like physical material items, right? And she says it generally to change physical or material aspects of a system, it's costly, and usually takes a lot of time. So I guess, if you return, if we go back to like that Home Depot example, to build more screwdrivers, it takes time to actually create something that's a material product, right? Whereas information is cheap and easy to flow, and some of our higher leverage points have to do more with information, and dealing with information rather than like physical stocks, physical items within the system. And then she also mentions, buffers can be too small, like in the river example, right? The fact that the river is small, and so if you increase the inflow with torrential rains or decrease the inflow with a drought, then you have significant changes to the size of the river because it's a small stock. You also can have things that are too large, right? So I guess again to go to the for some reason the Home Depot analogy with the screwdrivers, if Home Depot wanted 1 million screwdrivers on hand, they'd have more time before they need to order a screwdriver before running out, so they'd never run out of screwdrivers, but they had to figure out where they're to store 1 million screwdrivers, right? So there's a cost to having that much buffer in the system. So there's kind of like a middle ground between having too little so that the system is not stable, and is very reactive to small changes in the inflows and the outflows, or having too much where the system is just kind of inflexible and very costly to maintain.
Right, and also you can imagine that if you had to pay for the 1 million screwdrivers to be purchased on the front end before you're going to recoup your losses, right? You obviously would have to have like a significant amount of capital that would allow you to have done all that when you're not getting anything. You're not getting any of your losses recouped yet.
So it just reduces the efficiency, right?
Yeah.
And but the same thing can be said of too small stocks, right? So again, if you only carry one screwdriver a day, then it's very efficient, very limited cost, right? But now your maximum profit is just one screwdriver a day.
Yeah.
So
exactly. But and also too, I guess with the environmental stuff, there's some interesting things to think about here. I think because obviously, like, let's take something like all the we've gotten a lot of floods in the last like decade around the world, like horrendous ones because of or we believe exacerbated by like climate change and stuff. And so like obviously on one hand, the root cause would be to try to do something about the climate change itself. But does that mean? But that obviously will take some time to address before maybe things stabilize more and whatever, right? And in the meantime, we also can't just have all of our towns and cities and stuff get washed away in floods, right? So you might need to combo some type of short-term solution, right? It's the same with like health stuff, right? Like say you're getting headaches all the time. Well, probably at some point it would be useful to try to find the underlying cause that's causing the headaches. But that also doesn't mean
to see what's going on neurologically, right?
But at the same time, that doesn't mean that in the meantime you don't take ibuprofen or Excedrin or maybe some type of migraine medication.
You still have to deal with the symptoms.
You still have to be able to live your life, right? And even if sometimes like we shouldn't like understate the importance of also sometimes treating symptoms. Like sometimes you have to be able to get through the day. And that's going to require something to treat symptoms, even if it's not a long-term, fix or whatever. So again, with like, you mentioned like you could have too much of a buffer too. I was thinking again in terms of some of the climate change stuff. Like, they talk about, oh, this is like a once in 100 years type of storm. Are you going to build most of your buffers to be able to deal with the once in 100 years situation, or are you going to build it to be able to deal with more of like what you're going to see year to year, right? Because you could put a lot of cost up front into building some buffer that could deal with the once in 100 years storm, but again, you're only going to have that once every 100 years, so like the rest of the time it's like kind of overkill.
Well, but the real
But
problem, right, is that like with climate change, those once in a
yeah,
100 year storms are now happening like once every decade,
too
right?
frequent.
So,
Exactly.
right.
So then it
So
becomes
you saved in
right.
costs and to
Yeah.
to build for
Be like
what was not once in a 100 year storms, but now that you're dealing with them more frequently, the system is
yeah.
less robust. Yeah, and
Right.
so maybe building up
Exactly.
a larger stock of prevention measures
Right.
for deterioration of homes from once in 100 year storms would have been more effective,
Would have been more prudent.
rather than going a cheaper
Exactly.
route. Yeah.
So that's like the other problem too. Is like if the major disasters become more frequent, then you probably have to do something to address those, even
Hmm.
in the short run.
Yeah.
And with with all of these things in the real world, there's probably some value in considering like gray areas that it's not like there's necessarily one right solution and many wrong solutions or whatever. That
Right.
there could be a range of solutions that could be helpful, as well as obviously probably more obviously a range of solutions that would be unhelpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it's not necessarily that with all of these things that there's only one right answer that you have to land on in one particular way. That there could be like sort of a range of strategies that could be used to
Yeah,
combat
there's not going to be a
things.
perfect amount of
And
stock, right? To have, there's not
yeah,
going to be a perfect number of screwdrivers for Home Depot to hold. There's going to be
yeah,
too few. There's going to be too many. But then inside
yeah,
that range, there's going to be inside there. There's going to be some range of like, you
some
have enough
fluctuation.
to deal with
Yeah,
most circumstances.
right. And again, like obviously, you know, a lot of those things are going to be affected by outside forces, right? That go beyond what Home Depot is able to prepare for, or something like the storms or whatever, too, right? Because
Yep.
there are things, maybe there's some new, uh, there's some new product that comes from the market that requires a screwdriver to assemble, and everybody all of a sudden wants to buy that product, and so now everybody needs like the screwdriver, right? And like maybe Home Depot wasn't able to anticipate that initially, so there can
Yep.
be like these sort of
Or black
runs.
swan events.
Yeah, there can be sort of runs on the system, or like again, like a once in 100 year storm or something that comes along that's kind of hard to predict. Like again, statistically, we know this should occur once in 100 years, but predicting what year that's going to be is probably very difficult, even for
Right.
experts.
Right. Yeah.
So that's like the thing is there does have to be some fluctuation just to deal with these like externality type of events that are going to be beyond most humans capacity to really
Predict.
foresee
Yeah.
and predict with any like
Hmm.
real accuracy. So yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, good. So that was number 11. That was the second lowest on the rung, the second least effective leverage point that Ms. Meadows had identified. So next up, we've got the structure of material stocks and flows within the system, and so we'll talk about that next video.